So much that can be said about it. But ultimately, I think one of the first questions that I would have for a business is, how do you define your culture, right? Because if you don't have a strong understanding of what your culture is and how you define it and what behaviors you want out of your current employees, then it's difficult to convey that to a new hire, right? Because if your current existing group doesn't have a thorough understanding of it, then they're going to kind of be giving mixed signals potentially to the new hire.
Welcome to Jagged Edge podcast with Yogi Patel. Today we have an amazing guest, Ricardo Cuellar, and he is an HR expert, an author, a speaker dedicated to simplifying HR for small and large businesses. And when I say small and large, he works with small companies with 100 employees to a couple of thousand. So welcome, Ricardo. Thank you for making the time to be with us.
Thank you, Yogi. I'm glad to be here. Excited.
Is there anything I missed, Ricardo, on your work background? I know that you are doing some coaching now, but how do you work with different companies?
I think you covered it. You make me sound super impressive. So thanks for that. No, you know what? I think probably one of the things that I'm most excited about these days is I do have a coaching and consulting business. Basically, what we kind of specialize is in doing HR evaluations, where we basically sit down with a business owner, CEO, and executive in charge of the HR function of a business. And we basically go in and we evaluate from A to Z, just to make sure that they are as efficient as possible, that they're compliant with all the legal requirements that may apply to them, and just making sure that they're set up for success. You know, I kind of really specialize in building HR departments from the ground up. So it's kind of my forte, something that I really love to do. So it's something that I'm very passionate about.
So our audience, my audience, are often school leaders and small company executives. And one of the things that we'd like to talk about is, how do we get started? And today, hopefully in this next hour, we'll be able to empower and encourage small businesses or large businesses to take the step to creating an environment that is encouraging, empowering, and really we're a place where everyone wants to work. And I think we all want to create those environments. In your experience, what are the first signs of a truly world-class culture?
You know what? I think the thing that has always served me well is, what do the people say about what it's like working there, right? I think as long as you're listening to employees, really trying to get that core feedback from the employees, what's working well, what isn't, I think you'll really find out what works best for that business. Because let's say a top tier culture for a business that's, let's say, 2,000 employees that's spread out geographically all across the country is going to be completely different than a top tier culture that might be perfect for like a group of 25 employees that are all in one physical on-site office location. Of course, there's always going to be certain components, right? You want to make sure that people are engaged, that they're satisfied with the work that they do, that the management team is treating people well, that there's opportunities for growth, that people are being compensated fairly, being treated fairly with respect, and all those good things, right? There's always going to be certain common themes along that route. There's a lot of other fancier things that you can look at depending on the company size, the geography, and, you know, kind of how the company is built and what drives the culture, what drives the business.
So often we start a business and the culture sort of takes its own, shape based on what's going on in our community and situations from around the world. So what are some of the steps leaders can take tomorrow to create a foundation of a culture where when you talk with the employees, they're talking about things, they're getting their needs met? So what is that first step?
I think the first step, and this is one area where a lot of really businesses of any size kind of drop the ball in, is, I'll go into a business to start the evaluation process. And when we're talking about culture, I'll oftentimes ask these key stakeholders, business owners, how would you rate it? And everybody tends to, give me the first answer is just, it's great. Our culture is amazing, which is a good first step, but everybody says that. Once you start peeling back the onion a little bit and kind of going in underneath the rug, you start talking to employees. Sometimes they paint a slightly different picture, right? So with that being said, I think the first step is always going to be to build some kind of foundation for measurement for some of that feedback so that we can start looking, okay, let's pull our audience, so to speak, right? Let's pull all the employees. Let's find out what's working now, what isn't, what are areas for improvement. How do people really feel about our culture? And let's actually put some data behind it. Let's measure some of these feelings. And then let's see how we can improve over time, right? We might take an initial assessment and say, okay, our employees are really unhappy with maybe how our compensation decisions are being made, or maybe they feel like performance reviews aren't being done fairly, or whatever the topic is, or whatever the theme is. And then we might say, okay, let's lay out a roadmap so that we can tackle this one area for the next 6 months. And let's pull the audience again, right? Take another engagement survey 6 months down the road, and let's compare it to that original baseline and figure out, okay, have we improved? And if so, then great. What are some other areas that we might work on and improve on in the future, right? So I think it all starts with getting the measurements down and then having a foundation to build on from there. I think that's always the best first step.
Yeah, so having that foundation and knowing our people. And as leaders, often we put out policies, procedures, and we engage with our team members and we think everything's kind of going well. And then there's a surprise. What are ongoing things that we can do to truly understand the needs of our teams?
Yeah, it's interesting because it happens pretty often. I was actually just working with a client recently where they had someone that they kind of put on this development plan and a roadmap for promotion, and they thought they were doing everything right. And then all of a sudden she resigns, and, it kind of hit them, blindsided them to an extent. But then once you actually talk to the employee, you end up finding out, there's some real issues there that maybe they really weren't talking about during the length of the employment. And now they're working backwards to try and fix. So I think it always starts with doing a deep dive, and having those more thought-provoking conversations with the employees. Oftentimes when you're doing, let's say, the one-on-one type of traditional conversations, all too often managers are focused on, the tasks, the given projects of the week. And they don't really talk about, are you happy working here? Do you find it fulfilling? Do you enjoy the work that you do? How can I improve as a manager to support you more? What roadblocks are preventing you from doing the best work that you can? These types of questions are a little bit more deeper, a little bit more thought-provoking, but sometimes they will get to a root cause issue that might prevent that kind of turnover from happening in the first place. So, you got to look at this almost with a fine-tooth comb and do a little bit more of a deeper dive than just kind of the generic one-on-one types of conversations. I think that'll be very helpful, at least.
So we often have a need for a position in our company. We come up with a job description and we say, okay, these are some of the skills that we need. We go out there, we recruit this team member to come on board. How do we develop this onboarding process so that this team member understands the culture and the functions where they feel a sense of belonging, and then they can contribute to the level that we would like them to?
Yeah, the onboarding topic is an interesting discussion because there's so much that can be said about it. But ultimately, I think one of the first questions that I would have for a business is, how do you define your culture, right? Because if you don't have a strong understanding of what your culture is and how you define it and what behaviors you want out of your current employees, then it's difficult to convey that to a new hire, right? Because if your current existing group doesn't have a thorough understanding of it, then they're going to kind of be giving mixed signals potentially to the new hire. So I think it all starts with really looking at your existing culture, defining it. All too often you'll start with, the basics, like what's your mission? What's your vision of the business? A common one are the core values, right? But even if you look at something like a core value, let's say, as an example, I was working with a business recently that was saying one of their core values is speed is king, right? So they want to move quickly with everything. But at the same time, they also have a kind of a conflicting core value, which is that they want a high quality work output, which, there can be some conflicting messages there, right? Because if you're moving really fast, you may not always have the best quality if you're just trying to get things quickly out the door. But they never really took the time to explore what the underlying behaviors are that drive those core values. And I think once you start exploring, okay, well, which is it? And sometimes it may vary from one department to the other, but actually taking the time to explore, okay, if we're going to say speed is king is a core value, in which circumstances does this apply? And what does it mean? Is 4 hours a suitable response time? Is it 8 hours? Is it 24 hours, right? Depending on what the task is. But you got to examine all those underlying behaviors, because that's how you can actually put some SLAs around it, right? Some expectations, because then you can convey that to a new hire when they start, so that when they, even going through the interviewing process or the job description, you're able to now outline, hey, speed is king. And this is what we mean by that, right? These are the expectations of your specific job. And then when you're interviewing, you can talk about it. When you're doing the onboarding, you can build on it again and say, okay, this is what we meant. Remember, we talked about this interviewing process, right? These are our core values. This is what these core values mean for you in your specific job. And then this is how it translates to the department and the wider organization. So you can kind of build on it from there. And all too often, that's not done enough, right? Sometimes a company will say, okay, the founder will decide these are our 4 to 5 core values. We'll post them on a wall, and then nobody ever talks about it ever again, right? And then you ask a company, hey, what are your core values? And you might have 4 or 5 hands going up, hey, it's this and this, but it's not consistent messaging, right? So I think that's really how it kind of builds on itself, right? One step at a time. And just being more thoughtful about the entire sequence of events to make sure that the onboarding process in this case is as productive and as efficient as possible towards getting somebody to start and engaging the right behaviors from the get-go.
This is beautiful, and this is a great path for understanding what the culture looks like. Imagine, many times than not, we don't even know the culture that we want. Start a company, is doing well, we get busy into running the company and growing and just managing day to day. Now we decide that the culture is sometimes now turned, which is toxic in nature. Maybe employees are not happy and performance challenges are taking place. What is that first step right here? Where do you take the brakes on and pull the lever and say, we want to change the tracks? What is that step while continuing to operate your business?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think once you have that foundation of what are the behaviors that you want, then you can start examining, okay, when you're looking at the workforce, whether it's 20 employees or 150, whatever it is, you start figuring out who are the role models for those behaviors, right? And how does everybody else measure up against whatever these new standards are? Whenever you identify that you do have employees that maybe have become toxic over the years, then it depends on the circumstances, but you have all sorts of different options, right? You can engage in just honest dialogue with the employees sometimes and just say, hey, listen, I know we haven't been the most clear and the most passionate about our core values, but this is our direction moving forward. This is what they are. These are the behaviors, et cetera. You can outline the whole thing. This is how we want you to behave. And we've noticed your behaviors over the last couple of years, the last couple of months, whatever, just aren't quite in alignment with that. But we want to give you an opportunity to improve, right? Because we value you, and you can kind of have that whole discussion and giving the person an opportunity to change their behaviors, right? To now match what the business wants. I've done a lot of those conversations, and sometimes people will align with whatever the expectations are, right? Because they value their jobs and they want to be successful there. And other times people are going to be resistant, so much so that you may have to make a hard decision and let that person go, right? And you can find all sorts of ways of being supportive for that individual, especially somebody that's been with you for a long time, to give them a soft landing wherever it is that they're going, giving them time to transition, maybe a severance package, whatever it is. But as a business, if you identify this person has become toxic, let's say, and is detrimental to the overall team, then you want to do what's best for the overall business, right? And if sometimes that means you have to make a hard decision and let somebody go, then for the good of the group, then maybe that's the right decision to make. Depends on the circumstances, of course. But I think you also want to be honest as a business. And if you haven't kind of really outlined what the expectations are from the get-go and giving people an opportunity to improve and giving people the right feedback about what the expectations are, then you might want to start there first, right? Make sure that that's done well before you push people out the door, because you want to be, respectful of people. Obviously, it's people's livelihoods we're talking about. So you want to make sure that people have an opportunity to meet whatever the expectations are for the business.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up having that conversation and being really upfront with the employees. Yeah, we made a mistake. This is not the direction we want to go into. And having that difficult conversation is a key point, because that can really encourage the team member that we're speaking to or discourage them. And it can just turn from there. I've been in a conversation where you believe the conversation was beautiful, the other person understood what you said, and you walk away and things are a little bit different. So in your expert opinion, what are some of the ways when someone is not performing, underperforming, or things are not working? We always talk about documenting and writing up, but that human aspect of it, what would be the most, not everything's going to be successful, but what's the best route to take once we identify that we need to have this difficult conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting because, even when you look at the HR profession as a whole, it's very common mantra, right? For us to say documentation, 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 document everything. And I think from a legal perspective, that would be 100% my recommendation to be consistent with that, right? Is you want to document everything. And I think you do. But how you document things and how you present it to the employee makes a big difference. If you're having that first initial conversation with somebody, let's say it's underperforming, and you come in strong and you come in with, let's say, a warning, a disciplinary notice, a document that's in writing, a performance improvement plan of some kind, and this is the first time you're really having a serious conversation with them, that's going to be very off-putting for anyone, right? The fact that they're sitting down with somebody now, whether it's HR or a senior manager, and they're having to go through a document that looks like, because look at it from the employee's perspective, they're going to see it as your company's taking one step towards firing them. Right now, they're documenting everything formally with all sorts of legalese and the document, all sorts of oftentimes these HR documents will say things like your employment is at will, and if you don't improve, it's up to and including separation of employment, right? And all this sort of language that can be very off-putting from the employee's perspective, where a lot of times people will have a really adverse reaction to that. Well, they'll say, you know what, I guess it's time for me to clean up my resume and start looking for another job. That's usually not what the company wants. They want the employee to improve on whatever the behaviors are. So although that is a recommendation from, let's say, a legal perspective, oftentimes I think the best route to take is to just have that honest, open dialogue with the person and letting them know, like, hey, these are the issues that I'm identifying. And first, you don't want to just come out and cast blame, like, hey, you're doing all these things wrong. Have an open discussion, but say, are we at fault? Is the company not training you enough? Did the training that we provide not really hit the mark? Are we as managers not supporting you enough? Are there certain roadblocks that we're not seeing that are preventing you from behaving in this way? Is it because you're following another employee's, behavior model and they're not maybe the best example to follow? It's something going on at home, right? You got to kind of have this discussion to figure out what is preventing the person from, let's say, meeting whatever the standard is. It's also oftentimes really important for the manager to look internally and say, am I doing something wrong? Am I not being clear with the instructions I'm providing? Right? It kind of looking at all these different layers. And ultimately, you start with that approach, right? Just verbal. Now, when we talk about the documentation piece, I mentioned you can document it in different ways. It doesn't have to be a written warning document that's in writing that they have to sign that has all this scary legalese language. You could potentially just follow up the verbal conversation with an email to the person saying, hey, glad we spoke. Just as a quick recap from my own memory, we talked about X, Y, and Z. I think that we have a good game plan moving forward of how we're going to address these behaviors. Let's touch base in a couple of weeks and kind of see how things are going, right? And you're kind of still doing both things. You're having that human interaction with someone where you're kind of having these discussions, but at the same time, you're also covering your bases by documenting it in a less scary way with this kind of a quick follow-up email recap, instead of starting off with like the formal performance improvement plan. I think that's something that you can eventually escalate to, right? A lot of times you'll hear about the whole concept of following a progressive discipline model, which I think is the right step to take. Where I think a lot of managers oftentimes, and I think most managers do start off with a conversation. I think where they usually tend to make a mistake is that then they usually forget to escalate at some point and start documenting it on a more formal fashion with some kind of performance improvement template or some kind of plan. And that's usually where I tend to see that's more common than the opposite end of it. But that would be my recommendation overall to kind of make the experience as smooth as possible for both sides.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I think one of the things key here is really the human aspect, having those conversations. Often someone leaves and we promote from within and put these folks into a position of management. And this documentation seems to be one of the biggest challenges. So we sometimes document and then time passes, things are going well, the same problem occurs again. And then there's a gap and lapse. And what you just said made perfect sense. And we're talking also about human resources play an important role in a company. And what role should they play in shaping a legal and ethical framework and to set this business up for success?
I think they have to be a central figure in that entire process. You know, HR is already intertwined with the whole compliance and legal framework because we have to ensure that we're meeting, the requirements for federal law. That's a US-based company, federal law, right? And then any specific state requirements, and even for certain cities in the US, and maybe even local city jurisdiction requirements. So you already have a lot of that foundation to address those legal concerns, legal issues. But I think you can also take it a step further to touch on the ethics component, especially nowadays where now it's even getting a little bit more complicated because you're introducing AI into the equation. And you want to make sure that whenever you're making decisions, let's say you're using AI as part of the decision-making process, you want to make sure that you have a human in the loop of that decision-making process to make sure that you're addressing any ethical issues, any ethical concerns that might apply for whatever the topic is that we're looking at. But HR should certainly be a central figure in that whole equation because, oftentimes you need somebody who is focused on the people side, right? The workforce. And oftentimes you don't have a representative of the workforce in some of those senior leader discussions, right? Because you may have somebody like a CFO who's focused on the financial, right? You may have on the CEO who's focused on the mission. You may have a COO who's focused on operations. You need somebody that's a representative of, let's say, the people, the employees. And that's usually HR or whomever is in charge of HR for that company because and not to say that those other individuals can't give voice to those things, but usually it's HR who is most in tune with the employee experience. And therefore, they're usually the ones that should be a central figure in that whole discussion.
So what are most surprising compliance oversights? And what can companies, especially those who are spread out, maybe there are global companies and now we have challenges with compliance?
It's tricky, especially in the US. You see a lot of issues related to compliance, especially for smaller businesses. Usually the areas that I identify, especially when we do HR evaluations, tend to be around wage and hour violations. Someone's not being paid correctly on some level. Oftentimes it's related to FLSA classification mistakes where somebody is, let's say, classified as an exempt salaried employee and they really should be a non-exempt hourly employee. But because they're classified as exempt, they're now eligible for overtime, which then could be a potential source for litigation in the future, some kind of claim. So wage and hour are very common issues. Accommodation requests are often poorly mishandled by small businesses. And when I say accommodation requests, that could be an accommodation based off of religious grounds or religious accommodation. It could be a leave of absence type request for accommodation, a disability accommodation, a pregnancy accommodation. Those are oftentimes mishandled by small businesses because oftentimes they don't have the right foundation. They don't have the right framework of how to handle these potentially tricky conversations with employees. So usually somebody drops the ball and it's not handled correctly because they don't have an SOP, a standard operating procedure for how to handle these issues. So those are very common mistakes. Leaves of absences are always a common one. And then as you can imagine, if you expand your workforce beyond a certain region, right, it gets even more increasingly complex, right? You start adding in multiple states. Now you're talking not just federal requirements, but now you have to be in tune with whatever the state requirements are. Certain states are constantly adding new employment laws. Like if you're in Illinois, Colorado, Washington, California, New York, New Jersey, they're constantly adding in new requirements. So it's even more important to be in tune of how these things kind of all interconnect. And then you start talking about global, which was part of your question, then it's even more chaotic, right? Because everybody does their own thing. So you really have to learn to rely on a lot of other experts, outside experts that may be in tune with that specific market, that specific country, state, whatever it may be, to really make sure that you are kind of crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's, especially the more the business grows. Of course, it just adds more and more layers of complexity along the way.
Looking at national companies, each state has its own unique laws, wage changes, and variety of things that you just spoke about. What can a company do? What help could they require or request to meet these standards? And one of the other questions that I really comes up to me is, how do you find out when the laws are changing and share that information to every department?
So two things. One, when it comes to staying up to date, one thing that I learned early on in my career when I first started working in HR that served me really well and still does to this day is I subscribed to all sorts of legal blogs from law firms that specialize in employment law. And that's a key distinction because oftentimes people will have this perception of, well, I can go and talk to any lawyer. And that's not the case. You want to find a lawyer that specializes in employment law, right? Just like if you had a criminal matter, you wouldn't go talk to a divorce attorney. You'd go talk to a criminal lawyer. It's the same thing here. You want to talk to an attorney that specializes in employment law. And with that being said, I found it incredibly helpful just to find most of the larger employment law firms have all sorts of legal blogs that you can follow, and they'll talk legalese to each other all the time, right? It's intended for a lawyer audience, but as an HR professional or as a business owner, it's incredibly valuable because they start talking about changes all the time, right? Oh, this new legislation is being voted on in the state Senate. Oh, this governor just signed this into law. Oh, this law is going to go into effect such and such time. Oh, this court just struck down this part of this law, right? So as you're learning about all these different things, it really helps you to stay in tune with what's going on when it comes to employment law issues, whether it's federal or state specific. And it's also interesting because then you start seeing all the different times that, of course, attorneys will disagree with one another, right? So it's always interesting to find out, who's saying what and whatnot, but that's incredibly valuable towards understanding all the different changes as things come on.
How could these laws, how do we get this information to all the departments and managers? Because time to time, there are a few managers who lack this information and mistakenly, not knowingly, break these wage laws.
Yeah, I think it starts with training. You have to provide training. At the very least, one of the things that I'm a big advocate of, especially for management teams of smaller businesses where maybe they haven't had this training, is you always want to start off with a foundational kind of HR training where you don't expect the managers to become fluent in HR and learn everything that an HR professional does, but you want to give them a taste enough of what are the common pitfalls, red flags, certain words that employees might say, certain things that they might hear about that should trigger an escalation to somebody who does know HR within the business so that they can be correctly handled, because then that'll certainly go a long way. But to add to that, as legal requirements change over time, they at least have a foundation to kind of build off of, where then if you come to somebody and say, hey, there's a new update, let's say for sick leave requirements in your state, then they at least already know, okay, sick leave issues pertain to X, Y, and Z. I already know the basics, and it's only changing by, maybe the amount of time that somebody's eligible for, or the reason that somebody might qualify for sick leave. But they at least have a foundation to work off of. All too often, especially for managers, you find yourself in situations where these are individual contributors in the business, right, that were successful and then got promoted into management. But oftentimes businesses don't have a very thorough management training program, right, to build them up once they get to that. So they're just kind of learning on the job, which is fine. It's natural. But I think you want to augment it with some kind of more additional training for the entire staff.
So, Ricardo, do you work with companies in helping them design training plans? And if so, what is the best way to implement training throughout your company that might be national and then global?
So those are completely loaded questions. So it always starts with getting a basic needs analysis done, right? Figuring out, okay, what type of training would the managers benefit from or the employee population, right? So obviously you're going to have different audience groups within any company, depending on the size of the organization. And then figuring out, okay, what type of training do we start with? You might start with the training that I mentioned there about, kind of HR management training as a kind of 101 type of generic training to start with. And then you can build on from there, depending on what the needs are, right? Every business is going to be different. And then every audience is going to be different. Certainly a training that you might provide to, let's say, a mid-level management team is going to be completely different than the training that you're going to provide to an executive group, right? So you have to learn who your audience is, and then obviously build and customize your training plan to that respective audience, because otherwise you're going to run into that situation where, an executive will join a training meeting or a program and they'll say, oh, this is a waste of time. I already know all this stuff, right? And on the other hand, you may have people that are coming in that are new managers and they're like, oh, this is all new. This is great. This is exciting. But you kind of have to learn to balance it, right? You have to learn who the audience is. Nowadays, though, we're fortunate that there's all sorts of tools that make it easier than ever to build training plans for organizations. There's all sorts of tools that will allow you to quickly record a training, put it up on a website that's, custom white label solution for hosting the video content, that's courses. Even better now, you have all sorts of different tools in the market that are taking advantage of AI that allow you to use AI to quickly create a course that may be needed for your employee group, right? Which is a beautiful thing, because let's say, as an example, you're quickly, launching a new product line or a new service to your customers, or even a new policy change. You can use one of these tools to quickly get somebody in front of a camera, record a quick video, quick instruction of whatever the topic is, and then launch it out to your employees, whether that's on a global basis, nationwide, or even all local. But at least you have a way to track the training, make sure people are completing it, doing quizzes, all those kind of basic things as you're trying to kind of push out whatever the training plan is.
Well, this is very encouraging to know that there is a simple way that this message could go out, because often we don't have time. We just have the manpower. And with the help of AI and different tools, we can really maximize the option of training locally and get the information. What I do appreciate most about this conversation, what you just presented, was one size doesn't fit all. And often we go out thinking we are going to just have this one onboarding video that everyone watches and it'll meet the size. So let's say we've offered this training. What are some of the follow-up steps that a company can take in making sure that message sent was message received? Because often we're working in a world where there are different languages, different cultures, and that becomes our work culture. And we have to consider our whole group and their understanding of what we're trying to do. So what are some of the ways that you help companies sort of get on track of understanding their people and then providing training based on the needs?
Yeah, onboarding is such an interesting topic. It's interesting because I was supporting a business not that long ago where one of the managers told me that the onboarding program and training program that we had built for them was better than American Express's, and this is a company of like 200 employees. So by comparison, American Express has like all sorts of, access to resources. And I was like, wow, that's such a great compliment. And I can tell you that the root cause of that, at least based off of the feedback that he was giving us, I think was because we were constantly checking in with the learner. So as the employee starts and they start going through the onboarding sequence for this particular business, which was like a 90-day onboarding sequence, we're constantly checking in with the learner. So not only do we check in with them on the first day to explain what the onboarding program is, these are the courses that you have to take, and this is what you have to complete within the next 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, 30 days, etc. But then as they're progressing through the plan, we're checking in on them and we're getting feedback about what their experience has been to date. And if you do that consistently with one employee after another and after another, eventually you get so much feedback that you're able to fine tune the onboarding roadmap so that it basically hits on all the marks, right? And it really works well with the intended audience. And you end up customizing things quickly that way as well, because you may have, let's say, a group of employees that are starting in one state that are doing one particular set of jobs. their needs may not be the same as what you might need for somebody who's in a different state that works a desk job the entire time, right? You may have different needs depending on the occupation, depending on the department, depending on the state. So getting that feedback is really valuable because then you're able to check in. And oftentimes when, right, as an example, a company like Amex, American Express, they'll have all these resources, training programs, but they do a bad job of collecting feedback. They might send you a survey and they'll ask the employee, hey, if you have 5 minutes, please complete this survey. The employee never fills it out and American Express isn't getting the feedback. Meanwhile, in this program that we were building for this business, we actually had somebody reach out, schedule a call with the employee. They have, hey, these are the 10 questions we're going to be talking about on this call. We're going to be talking about your onboarding plan. And let's actually sit down and talk about it. It might be a 15-minute conversation, but then you're actually getting real feedback that you can use to improve on your onboarding plan instead of doing just kind of like the easy road, which is these, online surveys, which you hope people fill out, but people rarely ever do.
Yes. And Ricardo, often people fill out the surveys and then what do we do with it? Who's following up? And we spent countless hours in creating information. And thank you for sharing this whole process. I know this is so helpful because I remember being a new business owner, not really knowing this intricacies of what roles human resource plays and the importance of it all, right? And we're looking at driving engagement and profitability, and we need that other person. So how do you tell the leaders that employee engagement is just that one part of it, right? But it's also a profit driver because one relates to the other.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy because, back when we first started and we would do these really thorough evaluations, we would track all sorts of expenditures that were associated with the evaluations that we were doing. And we quickly learned that the average business that's, let's say, 10 and 19 employees in headcount was losing somewhere like $75,000 a year on average, based off of different metrics. So for example, individuals that were just not engaged, not producing, low productivity, poor performers, lost time related to turnover activity, right? An employee coming and going, a manager now having to sit down and interview you people and training somebody to get up to speed. Or it could be something a little bit more costly to the business, like let's say legal claims, right? A claim for wrongful termination, FMLA lawsuit. On average, is costing businesses like $40,000 to defend per incident. So you can really, if you look at all those different details, you can quickly figure out this is costing you money if you're not handling it correctly. So yes, HR isn't necessarily a revenue engine, right? It's not going to create profit for the business directly, but if you're handling it correctly and you're doing all these things correctly, you're going to prevent the business from having unnecessary expenses through some of these things like turnover, poor performance, or, cost of litigation. So I think a lot of it is about education, about explaining to people, this is what HR does. These are all the different categories. HR as a profession or even as a department generally doesn't have the best reputation, right? A lot of times people, especially from the employee side, will see it as, oh, that's the group that hires you and fires you. And that's all they do, right? So a lot of it is about education. And, sometimes it's not about what you say, but how you deliver the results, right? The behaviors that the HR department will engage in to really showcase like, hey, we do a lot more than just administration or the paperwork associated with the employment relationship.
I believe you're 100% correct in having the HR is seen as either when something goes terribly wrong, I need to approach them, or if they've contacted me, I'm about to be terminated or I've done something wrong. So how can companies change or HR departments do better? And how can we connect and create a culture where it's seen as a team effort?
Yeah, I think it all starts with relationship building. You have to be able to build relationships with the employees at every level of the organization, right? HR, especially whomever's let's say the head of HR, can't just be in tune with, let's say, the executive or the CEO. You have to be in tune with everybody in the organization, including the rank and file. You have to be able to build relationships at every level of the organization because that's going to go a long way towards addressing some of those issues. It's interesting because going back to what you were just saying about hiring and firing and all of that, I worked at a company once where it was very evident that every time HR called an employee into the office, they thought they were about to get fired. So much so that if they got called by HR, they were always kind of on their toes. They were nervous whenever they went to go talk to HR. They would tell their coworkers, oh, I'm about to be fired because HR is calling me over, right? And one of the things that we did in that business, at least to really kind of turn that around, is we worked out a system where we started partnering with the department managers so that every time somebody, let's say in a sales role, hit a specific metric where, they were deserving of an accolade or an award, or they did something great, even in just a small period of time, like a week or a couple of weeks or a month, whatever, we would actually have the manager tell HR, okay, this person did this week, or these are our top 3 performers for the week. And then HR would actually call them over to the HR department, not to terminate them, obviously, but to actually congratulate them. We would actually do things like, come on over to the department and, we would have like a prize wheel as an example, right? You spin a wheel and you get a prize. And we would put all sorts of different things like, hey, you get 4 hours of PTO or a movie, movie tickets or a snack, whatever. So we made it fun. So when HR actually called you over, you didn't know why you were being called over, right? It wasn't just to be terminated. They may be calling you over to celebrate something that you did really well on the job, and they're going to reward you for it, right? So it's little things like that can really just change the perception of how somebody sees the HR function by engaging in these little tactics. And that was just one of many, but that's, those little things can go a long way.
That's a perfect example of how shifting the beliefs of the employees from thinking punitive to really encouraging. Yeah. And I think HR has a very difficult role because they are helping with the profits by hiring, and they're motivating employees by finding the right fit. And folks who are happier are most likely to come to work on time and show up, right? And drive profits at the end. You've been doing this for a while and you're highly regarded. I was able to learn about your work through LinkedIn conversations that you have. You put out some amazing, beautiful ways to get the brain to think about different ways. Like, hey, am I this leader? Are these the cause and effects of the way things are happening within my group? And being able to sort of see things from different perspectives. So what is your most memorable coaching success story?
Probably one of the best examples I can come up with is I've had a couple of different times in my career where I've taken somebody who, I think of one person in particular who she was great at customer service, and that was her profession, right? She was focused on customer service. And I got to know her over a couple of years, and I realized, this was somebody who really should probably be doing HR because I thought she would just be great at it, right? And she didn't really see it at first, but I tried to convince her, and eventually we got her into kind of an entry-level HR role, and I started mentoring her and coaching her along the way. Now she's an HR director for a financial services firm. It took several years, but to me, that was always just a great experience to be able to see somebody grow from someone who had no idea with HR and then quickly, kind of moving up the ranks. It's something that I'm a big fan of. And in fact, I'm actually working on building out a program for HR or aspiring HR professionals to basically go through a structured program to learn everything about HR, because there's such a rabbit hole. There's so many different specialty areas within the world of HR. But in her case, it was great. And I've always found it really fulfilling to see somebody grow over the years, because HR is really one of those professions, I think one of the few ones left probably, where you can really go to great heights without, let's say, having a formal education, but just learning about it on the job. It's a very much a hands-on driven profession, I would say.
Well needed. I think human resource is such a broad area. They cover so many different aspects of it. And to roll out all of this information, it's just a beautiful, I would say you have to be a conductor of an orchestra, right? And really good at it. What can HR leaders do so that they can be strong allies to the CEOs, because both function really close together for the success of the company?
And I'm glad you're asking about the CEO specifically, because one of the things I'll sometimes point out when I'm working with some of these businesses is that they'll have HR reporting to the CFO or a COO or a general manager. And I think that's the wrong approach. I think it should be the CEO, because everything, especially when you're talking about some of the culture building elements, it always starts at the top, and it's really the CEO that you should have that partnership with. Not to take away from any of the other occupations, but it really should be the CEO. With that being said, I think it all starts when you're talking about a CEO relationship, you have to understand the business. You have to understand what's keeping the lights on, so to speak, right? How is the business profitable? How is it generating revenue? If you don't understand some of those basic dynamics of the business, the core service offering, the core products, if you don't understand some of those things, it becomes really difficult for you to have a comprehensive HR strategy around how the HR team can best support the employees who then, lead to creating all the profits for the business. And I think that's what really oftentimes will speak to the heart of a CEO, is the fact that they see that HR can connect the HR strategy with the overall business strategy. If you can't do that, then they start seeing you as more, you're just a paper pusher, right? You're just the hiring and firing center. I don't really need to go to you to seek counsel because you're not going to tell me something I don't already know. So that's really, I think, a key component of it. The more you understand about the business, the better you're going to be able to build that relationship with the CEO, especially when you're able to connect the dots between the things that HR does and how it affects the bottom line.
So what is that one question HR leaders should ask their CEO?
I would probably start off, just kind of an interesting question might be, how do you see the HR department supporting the overall business? What do we need to do to support the overall business objectives? I would probably start along those lines to see where the CEO's head is at, right? What are they focused on? Especially if this is an early conversation where you're just, maybe it's a new HR profession coming into a business, to figure out what's driving the business, what's going on today. Because obviously that changes over time, right? Businesses can be in all sorts of different stages of their growth. So you have to understand what he or she is thinking about the business in its current state, where it's headed, because then you can start talking about, okay, how are people going to be able to support you in getting to that place? And what does HR need to do to support the people to get to that place? So I think it starts with that.
It's a collaborative process. And I know what you just shared is really important, understanding how we're going to fit together in a puzzle here. Often you spoke about HR becomes the paper pusher or confidentially holding the information from CEO because this is our box. And there is that interlocking, there's that relationship aspect that you spoke about. And I think that could model from top all the way down the culture that you have, because often we talk about cultures in a company, but when you have these siloed areas or you have the disconnect between two C-level positions, we can often see things at the bottom line as well. This has been an inspiring conversation. I know we spoke about a lot of different things, so that these are common things that we all know about. However, not everyone knows how to solve some of these challenges, or that they're in the middle of these challenges. And my final question is for those AI, constantly changing world, folks who are small business owners, and maybe they don't have the financial ability at this moment. What are a few resources they can use in their HR to manage their teams, payroll, etc.? What would you suggest?
There's a couple of things. I mean, for starters, I mentioned like the law firms and their blogs. Those are usually free. I don't think I've ever seen one charge for it. So that's a free service that you can take advantage of from all sorts of major firms out there. Fisher and Phillips, as an example, has one. Jackson Lewis is another big attorney firm that has one. Fox Rothschild is another one. So you might have free resources there for compliance related topics. The other thing I would really push on, and this is a very common theme especially when we do HR audits or HR evaluations for businesses, is we'll go in and we'll see that a business owner has established a relationship with an outside vendor, let's say a payroll company, whether it's a full HRIS system, or maybe they're just processing the payroll, or, maybe it's the workers' comp or the benefits broker, all these different vendors. And oftentimes these vendors will have all sorts of different resources that the business owner or the HR department, depending on the structure of the business, aren't fully taking advantage of. This happens almost every time, especially because let's look at the example, let's say a benefits broker. A benefits broker that's obtaining benefits for your employees, they realize that being a benefits broker is a highly competitive space. There's a lot of benefits brokers that you could potentially go to as an employer. So what ends up happening is that they start adding in all sorts of value, right? All sorts of, oh, well, we're able to do this for you. And we're also able to do that. And if you have an issue with this, come to us. And we're also able to provide you with employment posters or all sorts of different things. But all too often, after a business owner will sign an agreement with a health insurance broker and say, okay, this is the benefits that we want for the year, we forget about the broker until it's time to renew benefits the next year. But all along the way, there's all sorts of different, let's say, benefits or different perks that broker is able to provide to you that you're not taking advantage of. Same thing with workers' comp carriers. I'll tell you a quick example because I recently had this one. There was this company who had all sorts of different safety issues. They work in construction. And the workers' comp carrier had, as part of the contract, beyond providing just the basic workers' comp coverage, they also provided safety loss experts that could actually come out to the business, do quarterly inspections of the entire premises, do free trainings for employees, and the business wasn't taking advantage of it. And all they had to do was pick up the phone call and demand of the workers' comp carrier, hey, we want to go ahead and schedule these loss consultants to come out and basically do these trainings right there. You're all of a sudden you're getting free training. All of a sudden you're getting free inspections that can help you improve on the safety front, at least. And that's the same thing for payroll companies. All too often they'll say, oh, we actually have an HR consultant that you can call into and get a basic question answered. And you can call us 12 times out of the year or whatever their allotment is, right? So there's all sorts of different resources that you may already be paying for that you may not even realize that you have access to.
Oh, this is beautiful. Wonderful resources. And what resources do you provide, Ricardo, for those who might be just interested in maybe, I don't know if you have blogs. I know LinkedIn, definitely you have a lot of content on. Could you help us understand that?
Yeah. So for myself, you can find me at Ricardo is HR is my LinkedIn handle. I'm actually working now to produce some free video content on anywhere short form video is available. So YouTube Shorts, TikTok, if it doesn't get banned, Instagram Reels. So there'll be all sorts of free education that I'll be putting out under the same handle name. And beyond that, we do have the HR consulting business. So if you actually do need consulting expertise, you can always reach out to me. Probably LinkedIn is the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Lovely. Thank you, Ricardo, for being on Jagged Edge podcast. And audience, if you like the content of this podcast, do not forget to follow and share us comments on what other topics you might want to be listening out for. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you, Yogi.